Welcome back. Once again, it is me, Alicia Wilford, and I will be delivering the wellness, watercolor, yoga, mindfulness curriculum portion of our retreat while in Tuscany. And I am a life coach. I work with very high performing women who might feel a little bit stuck in the work that they're doing. They might feel like they're in need of a transformation or a breakthrough. So one of the things that I do to help women in one of those scenarios, we work with a lot of creativity. Creativity helps in lots of different ways. So it doesn't matter if you think you're creative or not. Each and every one of us is creative. And a very easy way to tap into your creativity is actually to play with watercolor. Now, whether or not you already have experience with watercolor, it really doesn't matter, because watercolor is a very fun medium to work with. And the name of the game right here is to have some fun, to get into a state of play, which is what we'll be doing in Tuscany. And I wanted to give you a little overview of what we'll be doing before we go. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to take you through some of the tools that we'll be using in Italy and a few of the techniques. So if you want to try watercolor before we go, if you haven't already, you can start playing with these resources now and you'll be a little bit prepared. But don't worry, even if you don't have a chance before we leave for our trip, I will walk you through every step of the way when we get to Italy. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the tools. All right, so what we have here are a few of the tools that you need to watercolor. And what I love about watercolor is it's easy to take with you everywhere. It's not super messy the way an acrylic paint can be messy. And really, the tools fit pretty easily within a small space, so it's perfect for travel. Now, what you see here is I have a travel watercolor paint set, and you might be receiving some of these watercolors when you're in Tuscany from us. So this is a watercolor set, and this is the travel set that I have been using. I actually use it for all of my big watercolor paintings as well. So it's a great set that you can easily use. I get them on Amazon. They're not terribly expensive and they really do the trick. So this is the set that I use. When you get the set, it will come with something that looks like this, but it won't be painted. So it's then your job to match the paint colors with the paint so you can see what they look like, because what they look like dry in their little cube form is not the same as what they look like once you've painted them on paper. So we'll be walking you through this exercise when we get to Italy of really putting the colors down on paper. And that in itself is just a really fun exercise that I like to begin with. One of my favorite things to do when I get a new paint set is to just see what each of the colors actually look like on watercolor paper. Now, you don't need a lot of brushes when you start out watercolor. You really only need one brush, around 6. This brush can really do the trick. My favorite brush line is the Princeton Heritage series. Again, it's not super expensive and it's easy to use. You can get it on Amazon, but we'll be providing paintbrushes for you in Italy. So this brush right here, I'm gonna stick it over here in the water, and you can see that I am able to get a pretty fine tip here, and so that I can do pretty fine work or cover quite a bit of surface area with this particular brush. I do have a piece of paper. This is 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, and you can buy cheap paintbrushes, you can buy cheap paints. Really, though, you cannot skip when it comes to watercolor paper. You must use a watercolor paper if you're trying to get really nice, flowy watercolor paintings. It makes a huge difference, and Arches is the best. But when we're together, you're gonna want to have a travel journal, a travel watercolor journal. So we will be providing great little journals similar to this. They won't be exactly the same, but I've done a lot of watercoloring here, and you can see just some of the things that I've done in this particular watercolor journal of mine. I've painted a few scenes around the house a few times. And I've used this for other things as well besides watercolor, but this will give you an idea of just the ways that I've played in my watercolor journal recently. So that is what a watercolor journal looks like. It packs very easily for a trip. So what I want to show you today, I would like us to go through 2 watercolor techniques. And the watercolor techniques that we're going to be going through are, we're going to cover 3 things today, actually. We're going to cover, the first 2 techniques are wet on wet and wet on dry. So wet on wet is really just what it sounds like. It is the process of getting your paper wet, getting your paints wet, and then putting it on the paper. So I'm going to start by making a circle. I'm going to make my paper wet with clear water from a little jar, and you don't need a fancy little bowl like I have here. Even just a little mason jar will work. Normally when I travel, I carry a mason jar the size of one of those tiny little jam jars. And then I can add things in that. But then when I get water on a plane, I just use the little water from the plane and put it in there. So let's see, what color do I want to make this circle? I'm going to make it blue. So I'm going to take my wet brush and put it in this little blue square, and I'm moving it around like this to get lots of pigment on the paper. And now my brush is wet, the paint is wet, and the paper is wet. So wet on wet, I'm going to just go ahead and touch this into the wet areas that I have, and I'm kind of moving it around just a little bit to move the color, to move the pigment around, but it will spread out after a little while. So this technique, just letting the wet pigment move around on the already wet piece of paper, is the wet on wet technique. So that's the first technique that can be very useful in watercolor. Now I'm gonna clear off my brush in the water right here. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to do wet on dry. So I'm gonna leave this right side of the paper. I'm going to leave it dry. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna get some pinkish reddish pigment on my brush. I'm gonna add more water because I wanna make it really dark. So I'm just gonna make a square. So this, as you can see, is very different. It's wet on dry. My paper is dry, and I'm just using it to make a square here. Just like this. And I can even kind of fill this square in if I want to. And again, I'm just filling it in with the technique of wet on dry, because the paper is dry and my brush is wet with pigment. Just filling in right here. And anytime I teach, I have the desire to talk about Bob Ross, of course, because he's the master art teacher making his cute little happy trees. Maybe in Tuscany we'll make some happy trees. So as you can see, we have here in the circle, that is a wet on wet technique. And then we have a wet on dry technique. Now, another thing that can be very useful to know how to do is to know how to take your color from dark to light. So I want you to see what it looks like to take a pigment from the darkest it can go to the lightest it can go. So I'm going to pick another color. I think in this case, I would really like to do kind of an orange color. So I'm going to go ahead and I got my brush wet and I'm bringing it over to the orange pigment here, a little orange paint. And I got a lot of orange on the paintbrush. As you can see right there, there's quite a bit of orange pigment on that paintbrush. That's pretty much as dark as that orange is going to get, and it's kind of like a burnt orange, as you can see. So I'm bringing a whole bunch of that very dark orange at the top here so that you know how dark the orange is. But what I'm going to do without picking up more pigment, I'm just going to rinse off my brush. I'm going to get a lot of water on the brush here, and I'm going to slowly draw this pigment down. So very slowly, I'm just drawing this down so you can kind of see how it would slowly, I'm actually bringing just a little bit more pigment in so you can see how it would be dark to light. It just gives you an idea of from darkest to lightest what that color, what it can look like. So those are 3 watercolor techniques that we'll be using in Tuscany. I can't wait to paint with you under the Tuscan sun.